The subway platform was cold that evening. Maria Chen pulled her worn jacket tighter around her shoulders as she took her violin out of its case. She had been doing this for 3 years now, playing music for strangers who rushed past her like she was invisible. Most days, she wondered if anyone even heard the notes coming from her instrument. Maria was 34 years old. She had studied at one of the best music schools in the country, spent years perfecting her craft, and dreamed of playing in a grand orchestra. But life had other plans. The auditions never worked out. The callbacks never came. Eventually, she had to accept reality and find another way to survive. During the day, she taught violin to children who mostly didn't want to learn. In the evenings, she stood on this platform and played for coins. Grand Central Terminal was always busy. Thousands of people passed through every hour, all of them in a hurry to get somewhere else. Maria had learned to read the crowd. She knew which songs made people slow down even for just a moment. Classical pieces usually worked best. Vivaldi made people feel sophisticated. Mozart made them remember piano lessons from childhood. She had a whole strategy worked out. But tonight was different. Maria felt tired. Not just physically tired, but tired deep in her soul. She was exhausted from playing the same songs over and over, from pretending to smile when someone tossed a quarter into her case without looking at her face. She was tired of being background music in other people's lives. So she decided to do something she almost never did. She decided to play something just for herself. The melody came from somewhere deep in her memory. It was a simple tune, only 8 notes that repeated in a pattern. Her grandmother used to hum it when Maria was small. She would sit in her rocking chair by the window, and this sound would drift through the apartment like smoke. Maria never knew where it came from. Her grandmother never sang words with it, never explained what it meant. It was just always there, part of the fabric of her childhood. After her grandmother died 5 years ago, Maria found herself humming the tune sometimes when she was alone. It made her feel connected to something, though she couldn't say exactly what. Tonight, standing in the cold station with her violin, she decided to play it. She lifted her bow and let the first note ring out. The sound was different from her usual performances. This wasn't polished or perfect. It was raw and honest, each note carrying something she couldn't put into words. The melody was haunting. It had a sadness to it, but also something beautiful, like remembering someone you loved who was gone. Maria closed her eyes as she played. She let the music take her somewhere else, away from the cold platform and the indifferent crowds. In her mind, she was back in her grandmother's apartment, small again, safe again, listening to that same tune drift through the rooms. She played it once, then again, then a third time. People walked past her like always. A woman in a business suit rushed by, phone pressed to her ear. A group of teenagers laughed about something as they headed toward their train. A young father carried his sleeping daughter on his shoulder. Nobody stopped. Nobody cared. This was normal. But then Maria noticed something. An old man had frozen in place about 20 feet away. He stood completely still in the middle of the moving crowd like a rock in a river. People flowed around him, annoyed at the obstacle, but he didn't move. He was staring directly at her with an expression Maria couldn't read. She kept playing, but now she watched him. The man looked ancient. He must have been in his 90s, with white hair and deep lines carved into his face. He wore an old-fashioned coat and leaned heavily on a wooden cane. But it was his face that caught her attention. He looked like he had seen a ghost. Maria finished the melody and lowered her violin. The man still hadn't moved. She could see now that tears were running down his cheeks. His whole body was shaking. For a moment, neither of them did anything. The chaos of the station continued around them, but in that small space, time seemed to stop. Maria felt her heart beating faster. Something was happening, though she didn't understand what. Finally, the man took a step forward, then another. He moved slowly like he was walking through deep water. When he reached her, he opened his mouth, but no words came out. He tried again. "Please," he finally said, his voice thick with an accent Maria couldn't place. "Please play that again." Maria nodded, still confused, but somehow understanding that this was important. She lifted her violin again and played the 8-note melody. As the music filled the air, the old man's tears flowed harder. He wasn't trying to hide them or wipe them away. He just stood there, listening, as if the sound was breaking something open inside him. When she finished, he reached out with a trembling hand and touched her arm gently. "Where did you learn this?" he asked. Maria hesitated. My grandmother used to hum it when I was little. I don't know where she got it from. She never told me. Why? Do you know this song? The man's legs seemed to give out slightly. Maria quickly helped him to the bench along the wall. He sat down heavily, still gripping his cane with white knuckles. For a long moment he just breathed, trying to compose himself. I wrote that melody, he finally said. In 1943, I was 22 years old. Maria felt her skin prickle. 1943, that was over 80 years ago. How could this be the same tune? That's impossible, she said softly. My grandmother knew this song. She died 5 years ago, but she knew it my whole childhood. The man looked up at her with eyes that held decades of pain. What was your grandmother's name? Ruth Chen. Well, that was her married name. I don't know what her name was before. She never talked about her life before coming to America. Something changed in the old man's face. Hope and fear mixed together in a way that made Maria's chest tight. I had a daughter, he said quietly, in Poland. In 1943. She was just a baby, only 18 months old. I wrote that melody for her. I would sing it every night before she slept. It was our song just for us. Nobody else knew it. I never wrote it down. I never played it for anyone else. Maria felt the world tilt slightly. What happened to your daughter? The man's voice broke. They took her from me. In the camp. I searched for her after the war ended. I searched for years. I never found any trace. I thought she died. For 80 years I believed my daughter was gone. The noise of the station faded into background static. Maria stood there with her violin hanging from one hand, trying to process what this man was telling her. It seemed impossible. It had to be a coincidence. But that melody was so specific, so unique, and her grandmother had never talked about her childhood. She had always said she didn't remember, that it was too long ago. What was your daughter's name? Maria asked, though she was almost afraid to hear the answer. The old man looked at her with eyes full of impossible hope. Rachel, he whispered. Her name was Rachel Rosenberg. Maria's hands were shaking as she helped the old man sit on the bench. Around them, the subway station continued its usual chaos. Trains arrived and departed. People rushed past with their coffee cups and briefcases. But for Maria and this stranger, the whole world had narrowed down to just the two of them and a melody that shouldn't exist. Rachel Rosenberg. Maria repeated quietly. The name hung in the air between them like something fragile. My grandmother's name was Ruth Chen, but she never told us her original name. She never talked about her childhood at all. The old man wiped his eyes with a handkerchief he pulled from his coat pocket. His hands were still trembling. Ruth could be short for Rachel. Many people changed their names after the war. They wanted to forget. They wanted to start over. Maria sat down beside him, her violin still in her hand. She felt dizzy, like the ground beneath her feet wasn't quite solid anymore. Tell me about your daughter. Tell me about Rachel. The man took a deep breath. His voice was rough with emotion, but he started to speak. She was born in April of 1942 in Warsaw. The world was already dark by then, but when I held her for the first time, I thought maybe there was still hope. She had these big brown eyes and tiny fingers that would grab onto mine. She loved music. Even as a baby, she would stop crying when I played violin. Maria felt tears starting in her own eyes. She thought about her grandmother, who had died without ever speaking about these things. Ruth had been a quiet woman who loved gardening and cooking. She had always seemed peaceful, but now Maria wondered what memories she had been carrying in silence. I was a violinist too, the man continued. Before the war, I played in small concert halls. Nothing fancy, but it was enough. When they forced us into the ghetto, I couldn't bring much with me, but I brought my violin. At night, I would play for Rachel. That melody, those 8 notes, I made them up one evening when she couldn't sleep. It became our special song. He paused, lost in the memory. Maria waited, not wanting to push him, but desperate to hear more. In 1943, they started emptying the ghetto. They were taking everyone to the camps. I was 22 years old. My wife had died from illness 6 months before. It was just me and Rachel. I tried to hide her. I tried everything, his voice cracked, but they found us. At the train station, a guard pulled her from my arms. I was screaming her name. She was crying for me, and then she was gone, just gone. I never saw her again. Maria couldn't stop the tears now. She reached out and took the old man's hand. It felt thin and papery in hers, but she held it tight. After the war ended, I searched everywhere, he said. I went to every displaced persons camp. I looked at every list of survivors. I asked everyone I met if they had seen a little girl named Rachel. But there were so many children who disappeared, so many families torn apart. Eventually, I had to accept that she was gone. I came to America in 1949 and tried to build a new life. I got married again, had other children. But I never forgot Rachel. I never forgot our song. They sat in silence for a moment. The sounds of the station seemed muted, distant. Maria's mind was racing. Could her grandmother really be this man's daughter? It seemed too impossible, too much like something from a movie. But that melody, that exact melody. Do you have any pictures of her? Maria asked. Of Rachel? The man shook his head sadly. I lost everything. The only thing I escaped with was my life and my memory of that song. I never played it again after that day. It hurt too much. Until tonight, when I heard it coming from your violin, I thought that melody had died with me. Maria pulled out her phone with trembling fingers. I have pictures of my grandmother. Let me show you. She scrolled through her photo gallery until she found the folder marked Grandma Ruth. There were dozens of photos spanning decades. She started with the oldest ones, pictures from the 1960s when Ruth was a young mother herself. She held the phone out to the old man. He took the phone carefully, like it might break. He stared at the first photo for a long time. It showed Ruth at maybe 30 years old, standing in a garden with a baby in her arms. His breathing became uneven. The eyes, he whispered. She has my mother's eyes. And that shape of her face. It's like looking at my sister. Maria showed him more photos. Ruth at 40, at 50, at 60. In every picture, she looked peaceful but reserved. She never smiled big. She always seemed to carry something heavy inside her. She was a good grandmother, Maria said softly. She took care of me when my parents worked. She taught me to cook. She would hum that melody while she worked in the kitchen. I asked her once where it came from, but she just said it was an old song from a long time ago. She got this look in her eyes like she was somewhere far away. Then she changed the subject. The old man was crying openly now. She survived. My little girl survived and grew up and had a family. And I never knew. All these years I thought she was dead. Maria felt overwhelmed by the weight of what was happening. If this was true, if her grandmother really was this man's daughter, then everything changed. Her family history was different than she thought. Her grandmother's silence suddenly made terrible sense. We need to know for sure, Maria said, trying to think practically even though her emotions were spinning. We need to do a DNA test, and I have some things of my grandmother's at home. Maybe there's something that could help us figure this out. The old man nodded. Yes, we need to be certain. But in my heart, I already know. That melody doesn't lie. I never taught it to anyone. I never played it for anyone except Rachel. Maria looked at this old man, this stranger who might be her great-grandfather. He looked exhausted, wrung out by the emotional storm. What's your name? She asked. She realized they hadn't even properly introduced themselves. David, he said. David Rosenberg. I'm Maria Chen, Ruth's granddaughter. She paused. Maybe your great-granddaughter. David reached out and touched her face gently like he was making sure she was real. You look like her. Like my Rachel. You have the same determined chin. She was stubborn even as a baby. Maria laughed through her tears. Grandma Ruth was definitely stubborn. She had opinions about everything. They exchanged phone numbers. Maria helped David stand up, making sure he was steady on his feet. He looked older now, tired from the emotional conversation. But there was also something different in his eyes, something that hadn't been there before. Hope. Can I see you again? David asked. Tomorrow, maybe? I have some documents at home, papers from my search after the war, and I want to hear everything about Ruth's life. Everything. Of course, Maria said. I'll come to you. Just tell me where. As David slowly walked toward his train, leaning on his cane, Maria stood alone on the platform with her violin. She looked down at the instrument in her hands. This old wooden box had somehow bridged 80 years of pain and loss. A simple melody had done what decades of searching couldn't do. She packed up her violin carefully and headed home. Tomorrow she would visit David. They would look at old documents together. They would compare family histories and plan DNA tests. They would try to solve a mystery that had lasted 8 decades, but tonight Maria just needed to process what had happened. She needed to think about her grandmother in a new way. Ruth wasn't just the quiet woman who made excellent soup and grew tomatoes in her backyard. She was a survivor. She was Rachel Rosenberg, taken from her father's arms in 1943, and somehow, miraculously, she had lived. As Maria rode the subway home, she found herself humming that 8-note melody, the tune her grandmother had passed down without explanation. The lullaby a young father had created in one of history's darkest moments. The song that had waited 80 years to bring a family back together. Maria couldn't sleep that night. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything David had told her. At 2 in the morning, she finally gave up and went to her grandmother's old room. After Ruth died, Maria's mother had boxed up most of her belongings, but Maria had kept a few things. A jewelry box, some photo albums, a wooden chest that used to sit at the foot of Ruth's bed. Maria pulled the chest out of the closet and sat on the floor with it. The wood was dark and scratched, marked by decades of use. She had looked through it before, shortly after the funeral, but she hadn't been looking for anything specific then. Tonight was different. Tonight she was searching for clues about a life her grandmother never talked about. Inside the chest were layers of memories. Knitted scarves Ruth had made, old cookbooks with handwritten notes in the margins. A pressed flower between sheets of wax paper. Maria lifted each item carefully, looking for something, anything, that might connect to David's story. At the bottom of the chest, underneath a quilt, Maria found a small cloth bag she didn't remember seeing before. She opened it and pulled out a tarnished silver bracelet. It was tiny, made for a baby or small child. Engraved on the inside were letters that had been worn smooth by time. Maria held it under her lamp and squinted to read them. Her heart stopped. The letters spelled out R.R. Rachel Rosenberg. Maria's hands started shaking so badly she almost dropped the bracelet. This was real. This wasn't just a coincidence or a similar melody. Her grandmother had kept this bracelet hidden for her entire life. A piece of her original identity that she couldn't bring herself to throw away but couldn't bear to look at either. There was more in the cloth bag. A yellowed piece of paper folded many times until it was small and thick. Maria unfolded it carefully, afraid it might crumble in her hands. The paper was covered in faded handwriting, words in a language she couldn't read. But at the bottom there was a stamp and a date, 1948. The same year David said displaced persons were being resettled to America. Maria took pictures of everything with her phone. Then she carefully put the items back in the bag and held it against her chest. She thought about her grandmother carrying these secrets for 75 years, never telling anyone, never sharing the weight of what she had survived. "I'm so sorry, Grandma," Maria whispered into the empty room. "I'm sorry you felt like you had to carry this alone." The next morning, Maria took the subway to David's apartment in Brooklyn. He lived in a small rent-controlled building that looked like it had been there since the 1950s. When she knocked on his door, he answered immediately, like he had been waiting right there for her arrival. "Come in, come in," David said, moving aside to let her enter. His apartment was modest but clean. The walls were covered with photographs. His second family, Maria realized. Children and grandchildren. A whole life he had built after the war. "I found something," Maria said before she even sat down. She pulled out her phone and showed him the pictures of the bracelet. "It was hidden at the bottom of my grandmother's things. Look at the initials." David took the phone with shaking hands. When he saw the engraving, his knees buckled. Maria helped him to his couch. He stared at the image, tears streaming down his face. "I gave her this," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "On her first birthday. My wife and I saved for weeks to buy it. We had it engraved at a little shop near our apartment." He looked up at Maria. "She kept it. All these years she kept it." Maria sat beside him and showed him the paper with the foreign writing. "Can you read this?" David studied it carefully. "It's Polish. It's a document from a Catholic orphanage in Krakow. It says a child was brought to them in 1944 by a woman named Sister Helena. The child was approximately 2 years old. Female. No identification. The child was later transferred to a displaced persons camp and then adopted by an American family in 1948. "So it's true," Maria said softly. "Grandma Ruth really was your Rachel." David nodded, unable to speak. They sat together in silence, both trying to process the magnitude of what they had discovered. After a while, David stood up slowly and walked to a small desk in the corner of his living room. He opened a drawer and pulled out a worn folder. I kept records of my search. After the war, I spent years looking for her. These are copies of every list I checked, every camp I visited, every letter I wrote to aid organizations. He brought the folder back to the couch and opened it. Inside were dozens of documents yellowed with age, lists of names, photographs of children, official forms from various displaced persons agencies. Maria could see how systematic he had been, how desperately he had searched. "Look at this one," David said, pulling out a specific page. It was a list from a Polish orphanage dated 1946. "I wrote to this orphanage. They sent me this list of children in their care. But see, they didn't include the children who had already been transferred out. Rachel had already been moved to the DP camp by then. I was on an earlier list, but I never saw it." Maria felt her throat tighten. "You were looking for her at the same time she was being sent to America. You just missed each other." "By months," David said bitterly. "Maybe even weeks. If I had written to them sooner, or if the DP camp had been slower in processing adoptions, we might have found each other then. But I didn't know where to look, and she was too young to remember or search for me." Maria looked through more of his documents. There were letters to aid organizations, replies saying they had no record of a Rachel Rosenberg, forms from various governments, even a few private detective reports from the 1950s when David had hired someone to help him search. "You never gave up," Maria said. "I gave up eventually," David admitted. "In 1962, my wife convinced me I had to accept that Rachel was gone. We had 2 young children by then, and my searching was consuming me. It was hurting my family. So I stopped looking. But I never forgot, not for a single day." Maria made a decision then. "David, I want to share this story. I want to post about it online. Maybe there are other families out there who got separated and don't know their relatives survived. Maybe we can help someone else." David looked uncertain. "Are you sure? This is very personal." "Exactly," Maria said. "That's why it matters. People need to hear stories like this. They need to know that even after 80 years, even after everything that was taken from you, there can still be hope." That afternoon, Maria wrote a post on social media. She kept it simple, telling the story of how she played her grandmother's melody in the subway and an old man recognized it as the lullaby he had written for his daughter in 1943. She posted a photo of herself holding her violin and one of the baby bracelet with the initials RR. She hit share and put her phone down. "Now we wait for the DNA results," she said to David. "They should be back in a few weeks." But Maria didn't have to wait weeks for a response to her post. Within an hour, it had been shared 100 times. By that evening, it had been shared thousands of times. People were commenting, crying, sharing their own stories of family members lost in the war. A local news station reached out the next morning. Then a national one. Everyone wanted to know more about the violinist and the old man, and the melody that had survived the Holocaust. Maria's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Friend requests poured in from strangers all over the world. Holocaust survivors and their families reached out to say, "Thank you for sharing the story." Some shared their own miraculous reunion stories. Others shared their heartbreak about family members they never found. One message stood out. It came from a woman named Helen in France. She said her mother had been a Catholic nun who helped smuggle Jewish children out of the camps during the war. Her mother had kept a diary. Helen wanted to know more about Rachel's story because something about the date seemed familiar. Maria video called Helen that night, with David sitting beside her. Helen was in her 70s, speaking English with a heavy French accent. She held up an old leather journal. "My mother died last year," Helen explained. "She left me this diary. She wrote in it every day during the war. She never talked about what she did, but after she passed, I read it all. She saved 43 children. She kept records of every single one." Helen flipped through the pages. Here, April 1944. A baby girl, approximately 2 years old, smuggled from a transport train. Brown eyes. No identification. My mother took her to an orphanage in Krakow run by her sister. She wrote that this child had a small silver bracelet that they hid with her belongings. The room seemed to spin. David gripped Maria's hand so tight it hurt. "That was Rachel," Maria whispered. "Your mother saved her." Helen was crying now too. "My mother was Sister Helena. She never knew what happened to most of the children she saved. She died wondering if they had survived, if they had good lives. I wish I could tell her that at least one of them made it, that Rachel lived and had children and grandchildren. David's voice was thick with emotion. Your mother gave me back my daughter. Even though I never got to see Rachel again, she lived because of your mother's courage. As the call ended, Maria looked at David. He looked exhausted but also lighter somehow, as if a weight he had carried for 80 years was finally lifting. The DNA results will confirm it officially, Maria said. But we already know the truth, don't we? David nodded, touching the photo of the bracelet on Maria's phone screen. My Rachel lived. She had a... 3 weeks felt like 3 years. Maria checked her phone constantly, waiting for the email that would contain the DNA test results. She and David had both submitted their samples the day after finding the bracelet, but the waiting was torture. Even though they both felt certain about the truth, they needed that final confirmation. They needed science to validate what their hearts already knew. During those 3 weeks, their story continued to spread. News outlets from around the world picked it up. Maria did interviews from her small apartment, David from his living room. They told the story over and over, and each time it felt both easier and harder. Easier because the words became familiar. Harder because the emotions never dulled. A documentary filmmaker reached out. She wanted to follow their journey, to capture the moment when they received the DNA results. Maria wasn't sure at first. This was so personal, so raw. But David surprised her by saying yes. People need to see this, he told her during one of their daily phone calls. They need to understand what was lost during the war. But also what survived. Hope survived. Love survived. Memory survived, so Maria agreed. A small film crew set up in David's apartment on the day the results were supposed to arrive. Maria sat beside David on his couch, both of them holding hands. The cameraman tried to be invisible in the corner. The director, a woman named Patricia, sat quietly near the window. Maria's phone buzzed. Her hand shook as she pulled it from her pocket. An email from the DNA testing company. She looked at David. Are you ready? She asked. David squeezed her hand. I've been ready for 82 years. Maria opened the email. Her eyes scanned the words quickly, too quickly to really process them. Then she read it again, slower this time. The numbers and percentages swam in front of her eyes. Then she saw it. Clear and undeniable. Probability of great-grandparent relationship 99.8%. Maria couldn't breathe. The room spun. She turned to David and saw that he was reading over her shoulder, his reading glasses perched on his nose. His face crumpled. Tears poured down his cheeks. He made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She was mine, he whispered. My Rachel. She really was my daughter. Maria wrapped her arms around him. This old man, this stranger who had become family in a matter of weeks. They held each other and cried. The camera kept rolling, but Maria forgot it was there. Nothing existed except this moment, this confirmation, this miracle. Your grandmother was my little girl, David said, pulling back to look at Maria's face. Which means you are my great-granddaughter, my family, my blood. I'm your family, Maria repeated, like she was testing the words. They felt strange and wonderful at the same time. 3 weeks ago, she thought she knew her family tree. Now it had grown branches she never imagined. Patricia brought them tissues. They spent the next hour just talking, with the camera recording everything. David told stories about Rachel as a baby, how she loved when he played violin, how she would clap her tiny hands together, how she laughed at everything even during the darkest times. She was light in the darkness, David said. Even in the ghetto, even when we were starving, she would smile. She kept me alive in a way, gave me a reason to survive each day. Maria told him about Ruth, how she had been quiet but strong, how she made the best soup Maria ever tasted, how she hummed that melody while she cooked, while she gardened, while she did dishes, how she never talked about her childhood but sometimes got a faraway look in her eyes. She remembered you, Maria said suddenly, the realization hitting her. Maybe not consciously. Maybe she was too young to have actual memories. But that melody stayed with her. You stayed with her. In her bones, in her soul, she carried you with her all her life. David's hands were shaking. I wish I could have known her. Adult Rachel. Ruth. I wish I could have met her, talked to her, told her I never stopped looking, that I never forgot her. She knew, Maria said, though she wasn't sure if that was true. Somehow I think she knew she was loved. She must have felt it. Over the next few days, the story exploded even bigger than before. The DNA confirmation made headlines everywhere. People who had been skeptical now believed. The story was no longer just touching, it was verified. Real. True. Letters poured in from all over the world. Other Holocaust survivors shared their own stories. Some had found family members. Others were still searching. Many had given up hope decades ago but were inspired to try again after hearing about Maria and David. One letter stood out. It came from a museum in Washington. They wanted to include Maria and David's story in an exhibit about Holocaust survivors and reunion stories. They wanted the bracelet, the documents, the melody. They wanted to preserve this piece of history so future generations would know. Maria and David visited the museum together. Walking through the exhibits was overwhelming. Photos of people who looked like David, children who looked like Rachel might have. Maria had learned about the Holocaust in school, but this was different. This was personal now. These weren't just statistics or history. These were people like her great-grandfather, families like hers. In the section about children who were hidden or saved, they found photos that made them both stop and stare. Young faces looking at the camera with eyes that had seen too much. Some smiled. Some didn't. All of them carried stories that might never be fully told. Rachel could have been in one of these photos, David said quietly, if someone had taken her picture at the orphanage. They met with the museum director who explained how important their story was. People think of the Holocaust as just tragedy, she said. And it was. 6 million Jews murdered, millions of others killed. But stories like yours remind people that there was also resistance, rescue, survival. There was love that endured. There was music that carried through generations. David agreed to donate copies of his search documents. Maria donated photos of Ruth. They would loan the bracelet to the museum for the exhibit, though Maria wasn't ready to give it up permanently. It felt like the last physical connection to her grandmother's lost childhood. The museum also wanted to record the melody. They brought in professional musicians and audio equipment. David sang at first, his old voice cracking on the notes but carrying the tune perfectly. Then Maria played it on her violin. They recorded it separately and together. The sound engineer said it would be part of an audio installation where visitors could hear the lullaby that survived the Holocaust. After they finished at the museum, Maria and David walked to a small cafe nearby. They ordered coffee and sat by the window watching people pass by on the street. Normal people living normal lives. Maria thought about how you never know what stories people carry. That old woman crossing the street might be a survivor. That young man on his phone might be a grandchild of someone who was lost. What do we do now? Maria asked. The DNA is confirmed. The story is out there. What comes next? David smiled. It was the first real smile Maria had seen from him, one that reached his eyes. Now we live. We be a family. You come to Friday dinner. I come to your concerts. We celebrate holidays together. We do all the normal things that Rachel and I never got to do. Maria felt something warm spread through her chest. I'd like that. But David, you have other children. Other grandchildren. How do they feel about all this? They're happy, David said. They want to meet you. My son Daniel said it's like getting a piece of his sister he never knew he had. And my grandchildren think it's the coolest thing ever. They keep asking when their new cousin is coming to visit. Your new cousin, Maria repeated. The word felt good. Family. She had lost her grandmother 5 years ago and had felt that absence every day. Now, impossibly, she had gained a great-grandfather and an entire extended family. David reached across the table and took her hand. His skin was papery thin, spotted with age, but his grip was firm. I'm 98 years old, Maria. I don't know how much time I have left. But whatever time I do have, I'm so grateful I get to spend it knowing that Rachel lived, that she had a good life, that she had a granddaughter who plays the violin and kept our melody alive. Maria squeezed his hand back. I'm grateful too. For you. For this. For the fact that somehow, against all odds, music brought us together. They sat there for a long time, grandfather and great-granddaughter, connected by a melody that had traveled through decades and across continents. Outside, the city moved around them. Inside, two people who had been strangers a month ago sat together like they had known each other forever. Because in a way they had. Blood knew blood. Love knew love. And music, beautiful and mysterious, had remembered what history tried to erase. 6 months had passed since that cold February evening when Maria played a simple melody in the subway. 6 months since an old man stopped in his tracks and recognized a lullaby he thought had died with his daughter. Now on a warm August night, Maria stood backstage at Carnegie Hall adjusting her dress and trying to calm her racing heart. Tonight was different from any performance she had ever done. This wasn't about her. This wasn't even really about the music, though music had brought them all here. Tonight was about memory, about survival, about a family reunited across 80 years of separation and loss. Through the curtain, Maria could hear the audience settling into their seats. The hall was completely sold out. Over 2,000 people had bought tickets. The money raised would go to Holocaust education programs and organizations that helped families search for lost relatives. But more than the money, tonight was about bearing witness, about making sure the world remembered. Maria peeked through the curtain and spotted David in the front row. He wore a suit that his son had helped him pick out. Beside him sat his other children and grandchildren, 3 generations of family he had built after the war. And next to them were empty seats. Maria had insisted on those. Empty seats for Rachel, for David's first wife, for all the family members who should have been there but weren't. Her mother was there too, sitting a few rows back. Learning that her mother had been adopted, that Ruth had been a Holocaust survivor, had shaken her entire sense of identity. She had spent weeks going through old family documents trying to piece together a history her mother had never shared. It had been hard, but she had also told Maria she was grateful to finally understand why her mother had been the way she was. Why she held her children so tight, why she never wasted food, why she sometimes got a distant look in her eyes. The stage manager touched Maria's shoulder. 5 minutes, Maria nodded and picked up her violin. The instrument felt heavier tonight, weighted with meaning. She thought about her grandmother's hands touching this same wood. Ruth had given her this violin for her 16th birthday. At the time, Maria thought it was just a generous gift. Now she wondered if there was more to it. If somehow Ruth had known that music was important, that it connected them to something she couldn't speak about. A woman approached her backstage. It was Helen, who had flown in from France for the concert. Her mother's diary, the one that documented saving Rachel, was now part of the Holocaust Museum exhibit. But tonight Helen had brought something else. "I wanted you to have this," Helen said, holding out a small photograph. It was old and faded, the edges worn soft. It showed a young nun holding a small child. "My mother kept this hidden in the diary. I found it last week when I was going through her things again. Look at the back." Maria turned the photo over. In faded pencil, someone had written, "R. April 1944. "That's Rachel," Helen said softly. "That's your grandmother. My mother took this photo the day she brought her to the orphanage. She wasn't supposed to keep any evidence, but she couldn't help herself. She wanted to remember the children she saved." Maria stared at the photo. The child in the picture was tiny, maybe 2 years old, with dark curly hair and big eyes. She was holding on to the nun's habit with small fists. Maria looked for resemblance, for some connection to the grandmother she remembered. Maybe the shape of the eyes. Maybe the set of the jaw. "She looks scared," Maria whispered. "She was," Helen said, "but she was also safe. My mother made sure of that." 2 minutes, the stage manager called. Helen squeezed Maria's hand. "Your grandmother survived. She lived a full life. She had children and grandchildren. She won. That's what my mother would want you to know. Rachel won." Maria carefully tucked the photo into her pocket. She would frame it later, put it beside the other photos of Ruth. A bridge between 2 lives, 2 identities, 2 versions of the same person. The lights dimmed in the audience. Maria walked onto the stage. The applause was immediate and overwhelming. She stood in the spotlight and waited for it to fade. When the hall finally quieted, she spoke into the microphone. "Thank you all for coming tonight. 6 months ago, I was playing violin in a subway station, just trying to make enough money to pay rent. I played a melody my grandmother used to hum. A simple tune, only 8 notes. I didn't know where it came from. I didn't know it would change my life," she told the story. The old man who stopped to listen. The tears on his face. The impossible connection. The bracelet. The DNA test. The diary. Every piece that had fallen into place like a puzzle assembling itself after 80 years. "My great-grandfather is here tonight," Maria said, gesturing to David in the front row. "He's 98 years old. For most of his life, he believed his daughter died in the Holocaust. He never knew she survived. He never knew she grew up, got married, had children. He never knew about me." The audience was completely silent. Maria could see people wiping their eyes even from the stage. Music saved us, she continued. Not from the Holocaust. Nothing could save people from that except courage and luck and the kindness of people like Sister Helena, who risked her life to smuggle children to safety. But music saved us from never knowing each other. It carried memory forward when everything else was taken away. It connected us when we thought we were alone. Maria raised her violin. Tonight I'm going to play that melody first. Then David is going to join me on stage and we're going to play it together. After that, we have other musicians who will perform pieces written by composers who died in the Holocaust. Music that was almost lost, just like we were almost lost to each other, but survived, just like we survived. She put the violin under her chin and began to play. The 8 notes filled the hall, simple and haunting. She played it once, twice, 3 times. Each repetition was slightly different, like memory itself. Sometimes clear, sometimes fading, but always there. Then David walked slowly onto the stage. The audience applauded, but he waved them quiet. He carried a violin that the museum had loaned him for tonight. He hadn't played in years, he had told Maria. His hands were too old, too stiff. But he wanted to try. Just once. They stood together, great-grandfather and great-granddaughter, and played the melody together. David's fingers shook on the strings. The notes weren't perfect, but they were real. They were true. This was the song he had created for his baby daughter in 1943, and here he was in 2025, playing it with that daughter's granddaughter. When they finished, the audience erupted. People stood, they clapped and cried and bore witness to this moment. David lowered his violin and turned to Maria. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. They hugged on stage while 2,000 people watched and remembered and understood that some things, some loves, cannot be destroyed. The rest of the concert was beautiful. Musicians played pieces by composers who had died at Auschwitz, at Treblinka, at other camps whose names were carved into history's darkest chapter. Music that had been preserved by survivors, by people who had memorized scores, by hidden manuscripts that were found decades later. After the final piece, Maria returned to the stage alone. She had one more thing to say. My grandmother died 5 years ago. She never told us about her past. She carried those memories alone, and I wish I had known. I wish I could have told her it was okay to share them, that we would have understood, that we would have loved her even more for surviving. She pulled the photograph from her pocket. But today I received this picture. It's my grandmother at 2 years old, the day she was brought to safety, and I realized that maybe she didn't need to tell us in words. She told us in other ways. She taught me to never waste food, to hold family close, to find joy in simple things. And she gave me music. She gave me this violin, and she gave me the melody that would eventually bring me to David. Maria looked directly at the empty seats in the front row. Grandma, if you can hear me, I want you to know that we found him. We found your father, and he never stopped loving you. He never stopped looking. And now we're a family again. Not the same family you should have had, but a family nonetheless. The audience was silent. Then someone started clapping. Then another. Then everyone was standing again, applauding not just for the music but for memory, for survival, for love that transcends time and trauma and loss. Backstage after the concert, Maria found David surrounded by his family. They were all talking at once, excited and emotional. When David saw Maria, he broke away and came to her. Thank you, he said simply. For what? For playing that melody in the subway. For keeping it alive. For finding me, he smiled. Rachel would be so proud of you. Maria felt tears running down her face. I wish I could have known her. The real her, Ruth and Rachel. Both versions. You do know her, David said. She's in you. In your music. In your kindness. She lives on through you. That's how we defeat death. That's how we defeat the people who tried to erase us. We remember. We tell the stories. We keep playing the song. Later that night, Maria stood on the subway platform where this had all begun. It was late. The station was nearly empty. She took out her violin and played the 8-note melody one more time. Just for herself. Just for Ruth, just for Rachel. Just for David. Just for all the people who were lost and all the people who survived and all the people who remembered. A few people stopped to listen. They dropped money in her case.